Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Before introducing our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge that the NCTC is located within the homeland of the Massachusetts Nation, and for that we give thanks. Today we are going to hear from Shaun Grassel, who is an enrolled member of and a wildlife biologist for the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. He has worked for his tribe for over 20 years on the conservation and management of wildlife species. Shaun's work includes monitoring population trends of game species and focal non-game species, conducting research, and assisting with the development of policy. Shaun has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences from South Dakota State University and a doctoral degree in Natural Resources from the University of Idaho. Thank you, Shaun, for joining us today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in, and I wanted to thank Jennifer for that introduction. The only things I'd like to add is that I consider myself very fortunate, and I'm very grateful that I was able to do my master's research and PhD research on Lower Brule, studying different aspects of management and ecology of different wildlife species. But for my doctoral work, ferrets were the central part of my research. The title of my presentation today is Reintroduction of Black-Footed Ferrets to Tribal Lands. I'd like to thank Jennifer Hill and others with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the opportunity to share something with you all that is very near and dear to my heart. Next slide, please. The purpose of my presentation is to showcase tribal involvement in the recovery of the black-footed ferret. I wasn't sure who all would be attending and how much people knew about ferrets, so I thought I'd share a little bit about the natural history and legal status of ferrets before highlighting tribal efforts to recover ferrets. Slide, please. Black-footed ferrets are between 18 and 24 inches in length and weigh between 1.5 and 2.5 pounds. They are sexually dimorphic, with females being on the lower end and males on the higher end of those ranges. They have yellow to buff-colored fur, a black face mask, and black on their legs and tail, and they are nearly white on their forehead, muzzle, and throat. Ferrets are highly nocturnal, so efforts to monitor or locate them always occurs at night, with the aid of spotlights to detect their reflective eye shine. Ferrets are prairie dog specialists, which means they depend on the burrows created by prairie dogs for shelter, and their diet is primarily comprised of prairie dogs. They are solitary and very territorial and require large landscapes of prairie dogs to survive. Slide, please. Breeding occurs during March and April, which means they're in the breeding season now. And after a 41 to 43 day gestation, 3 to 4 kits are born. The kits stay underground, and their mother might move them occasionally before they emerge in July and August. Kits stay with their mother until they disperse in September and October and start creating their own territories in different areas. Next slide. Ferrets use prairie dog colonies in the short to mid-grass prairies. And as I mentioned before, they are highly dependent on prairie dogs for food and burrows. The historical range of ferrets mirrors the historical range of the black-tailed, white-tailed, and Gunnison's prairie dogs. Next slide. Ferrets have been classified as an endangered species since 1967 and are often touted as the most endangered mammal in North America. In the early 70s, the last known population was in South Dakota, but that population went extinct in 1974. So from 1974 to 1981, they were thought to be extinct until a population was discovered in Wyoming. But that population started to decline, and a small number of animals were captured to start a captive breeding program. The captive breeding program has been very successful, and as a result, there have been ferrets reintroduced at 29 sites. However, reestablishing ferrets isn't without its challenges. Only 16 sites are considered active, and only a few are considered self-sustaining. Next slide, please. Of the 29 sites, 27 are in the US, 1 is in Mexico, and 1 is in Canada. Next slide, please. The biggest challenge to ferret recovery is sylvatic plague, which is a non-native disease that is caused by a bacteria that is carried by fleas. It was first introduced to the West Coast in the early 1900s and has slowly spread eastward. Plague is lethal to both ferrets and prairie dogs, and epizootics can kill 90 to 100% of prairie dogs and ferrets when they occur. The map is by the CDC and is from the early 2000s and is outdated. Plague is believed to be present within the entire range of the ferret and has completely decimated some other ferret reintroduction sites. With plague in many of the systems where ferrets have been released, it requires managers to implement plague mitigation measures. Each year, most site managers capture and vaccinate ferrets on their site and either apply a dust to prairie dog burrows that kills fleas or distribute a fipronil-treated grain bait that controls fleas after being eaten by prairie dogs. Plague management is expensive and labor intensive, and not every site has the resources to do it. Next slide, please. The other threat to ferret recovery is the inadequate regulatory mechanisms, which are primarily large-scale poisoning efforts to control prairie dogs. Prairie dogs can compete with livestock for forage and are often controlled by farmers and ranchers and state, federal, and tribal agencies. In addition, unregulated recreational shooting of prairie dogs, which often occurs on some public lands, can be reestablishing ferret populations in those areas. Next slide, please. Intolerance for prairie dogs by the farming and ranching community is an obstacle to recovery, and it can create apathy and contributes to a lack of will by many agencies charged with managing and conserving wildlife. Prairie dog management often becomes a political topic that state, federal, and tribal agencies sometimes cannot overcome. Many in the farming community also fear government regulations and interference in how they might use their land. Although some tribes have adequate, suitable habitat, the political will, and local support, many tribes don't often have the financial resources to be a partner in ferret recovery because of insufficient support for tribal programs. There are grant programs available to tribes, but most are highly competitive, short-term, or have funding caps that are too low to fund all the necessary activities of the ferret reintroduction program. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit more about tribal involvement in ferret recovery. The map shows the historical range of the ferret and Indian reservations. As you can see, there are numerous reservations within the range of the black-footed ferret. I'm not sure how many currently have suitable habitat for ferrets, or how many could work to develop suitable habitat, but there are certainly several. This gives you a picture of the potential for tribes to contribute to ferret recovery. Next slide, please. There are 56 Indian reservations within the range of the ferret. I'm not sure where all of you are located, and if you have a role involving certain endangered species recovery, but I encourage those of you that do to look at the list of reservations and where they're located, and if any are near you, make contact with the tribes on those reservations and start a conversation about ferrets. Many of the reservations won't have suitable habitat. They also think many will. Next slide, please. So far, there have been 8 tribes involved in some degree of ferret recovery. In Arizona, The Navajo Nation owns much of the land where ferrets have been reintroduced and are cooperators with the Arizona Game and Fish. The Hualapai Reservation is adjacent to the Arizona site and have had ferrets move onto their lands, and they have helped the Arizona Game and Fish Department to monitor those ferrets. Tribes that have taken the primary role of reintroducing ferrets onto their lands include the Gros Ventre and Assiniboine tribes of the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, the Cheyenne River Sioux, the Rosebud Sioux, Lower Brule Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and most recently the Crow tribe. Next slide, please. Like all sites, the tribal sites have been challenged by plague. Ferrets were reintroduced to the Fort Belknap site in 1997, but soon after the site suffered from a plague epizootic and lost all of its ferrets. But over time, prairie dog colonies rebounded, plague mitigation measures were implemented, and ferrets were reintroduced there again a few years ago. The Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe in South Dakota reintroduced ferrets for the first time in 2000 and became one of the most successful sites in North America. In 2006, this site supported at least 175 ferrets, but plague decimated this site and prairie dogs have been slow to recover. However, the tribe continues to be involved in ferret recovery and has released a small number of ferrets there this past year. The Rosebud Sioux Tribe first released ferrets in 2004. This site was very successful, but the tribe and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had a falling out, and the tribe stopped all of their ferret work. This site was hard hit by plague, and prairie dog numbers are considerably lower there now. But without any plague mitigation, ferrets have persisted there, and just in the last couple months, 2 roadkill ferrets were recovered. The number of ferrets at this site is unknown, but the tribe is considering becoming more active in ferret recovery. The Lower Brule Sioux Tribe first released ferrets in 2006. At the time of the reintroduction, our site was one of the smallest sites in terms of available habitat where ferrets had been reintroduced. Our site exceeded our expectations, and we quickly reached carrying capacity. We had an estimated 50 to 60 ferrets in the fall of 2010, with plague epizootics in 2000 and 2011, or 2011 and 2013, reduced the amount of prairie dog habitat across the reservation by 90%. We thought plague had reduced our ferret numbers to 0, but a single ferret was observed in 2015, and a litter was observed in 2016. Time and plague mitigation measures have allowed our prairie dog populations to increase, and a few years ago, we started reintroducing ferrets again. And as our prairie dog populations have increased, so have our ferret population. In this last year, we recorded at least 21 different animals and had at least 5 litters. The Northern Cheyenne Tribe first released ferrets in 2008. Their site experienced a plague epizootic shortly after their first release, but they've been implementing plague measures the last several years and are considering future ferret releases. The Crow tribe was the latest tribe to reintroduce ferrets. They reintroduced ferrets a few years ago, and their population is small, but they have potential to have a modest-sized ferret population. Next slide, please. So I'm often asked why my tribe got involved in ferret recovery. And I think our reasons are similar and shared by many other tribes that I've mentioned. Like many agencies and organizations, we believe in species conservation. We work to improve habitat and address threats for many species, especially those that have small populations. We try and approach conservation from an ecosystem approach, and strive to have all the species represented there that were here historically. I think that we and other tribes feel an obligation to our wildlife resources to do what's right. And this stems from the cultural significance that many species have to us. Next slide, please. And ferrets have cultural significance to many tribes. My tribe is Lakota, and in our language, ferrets are called Thespisa adopta sapta, which means black-faced prairie dog. They were also called Adopta sapakin, which means black stripe across the face. They were known to be elusive, hard to catch, and hard to kill, for which they were respected, and people emulated them to gain their powers so that they too would be hard to kill if in battle. Ferrets were considered sacred because they were believed to have knowledge of medicines. For example, snow in the mountain is a medicinal plant that is found on prairie dog colonies, and the root is used by some and considered medicinal. Because ferrets live underground, where the roots are, ferrets were considered to have this knowledge and know how to use the medicines. And because ferrets knew these things and were sacred, their pelts were used as medicine bundles during ceremonies. Sacred objects like pipes, tobacco, sage, and other medicines were kept in the medicine bundle. The Navajo used ferret parts and pelts for medicinal purposes and ceremonial adornments. The headdresses of the Cheyenne and Blackfeet chiefs were often adorned with ferret pelts. The Hualapai traditionally regarded all living things that come out at night as sacred. And like the Lakota, the Crow used ferret pelts in ceremonies as medicine bundles. And the Pawnee had stories in which black-footed ferrets were given special powers. Next slide, please. So in the context of downlisting and delisting ferrets, I think tribes play a very important role. Recovery goals call for a pre-breeding census of 1,500 wild ferrets to downlist, and 3,000 are needed to delist. Next slide, please. 10 populations are needed to downlist, and 30 populations are needed to delist. Next slide, please. No fewer than 30 breeding adults in any population are needed to downlist, and at least 10 populations with 100 or more breeding adults are needed to delist. Next slide, please. And those populations need to be as widely distributed as possible. Next slide, please. So I think that tribes play an important and a unique role in the recovery of black-footed ferrets. Tribes have control over large amounts of land and have some of the best remaining habitat for ferrets. There are numerous tribes and reservations across the range of the ferrets, and many have the capacity needed to implement a reintroduction project. So in my opinion, I don't think ferrets can be recovered without tribes. We just need to figure out how to develop and channel adequate resources to tribes. Next slide, please. I wanted to end with this slide. The context of this quote by R.M. May was about the political differences that occurred during the ferret recovery program that at the time were one of the program's biggest challenges. It serves as a reminder of how far the ferret program has come since its early days. Although it might seem like doom and gloom in the world of ferrets quite often, the program has made amazing strides. The captive breeding center knows how to raise ferrets, and the field sites know how to keep them on the ground. And the challenges that we face are costly, but they're not insurmountable. And my tribe and I are really proud to be part of this story. I'll do my best to answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Shaun, for that. At this time, we're going to go into questions and answers. So if you have any, please enter them into the chat box and we'll have Shaun answer them. So here's a question, Shaun. How do the tribes learn how to access resources to support black-footed ferret populations?
How do we learn about resource opportunities? Well, that's a good question. I think, as opportunities arise out there, yeah, you need to be able to try to link up with those resources. But if a tribe in particular is interested in funding towards ferret recovery, and there's the Blackfoot Ferret Recovery Center that is an awesome resource. Other tribes that are involved in ferret recovery, I'm sure would lend a hand at any time. I always make myself available, so anybody could contact me. And I'll share what I know about what resources are out there. There's a Black-footed ferret recovery website that sometimes contains that kind of information. Other times it's just kind of, keeping your ears open and eyes open and just seeing what's out there.
Are there any biological mechanisms that have been identified to help combat the plague?
So in terms of like a biocontrol, no.
Yeah.
No, there are not. As I mentioned, there's an insecticide or pullicide dust that is applied to burrows. So that controls fleas in the burrows and on the ground. Prairie dogs get it in their hair and take it deeper into the burrows. And it does a really good job of controlling fleas. We use a fipronil treated grain bait. And so we distribute that across prairie dog colonies. And when prairie dogs eat the bait, just like giving fipronil to your cat or dog, when fleas try to take a blood meal, it kills them. And so it kind of stops the cycle of fleas. And some studies suggest that both of those methods can last up to a year. But right now there aren't any biocontrol methods.
So what are your thoughts about the recent cloning of black-footed ferrets?
I personally think it's great. I think it adds another tool to our toolbox. I think, using technology as often and as best as we can only further, our goals of recovering ferrets. Especially because of some of the genetic issues that face ferrets in the field and the ferret recovery program as a whole. This just helps stave off, some of the problems with inbreeding and that nature. And this is also, it's a model for other endangered species programs. So I really like it. I really support it. I'm really excited about it.
Let's see here. In addition to what you listed, are there any other threats that black-footed ferrets face that you're aware of?
Yeah, they can suffer from predation. That's not considered a major threat, but it can be an issue, like on small sites like we have here at Lower Brule. And the issue is, as ferrets disperse, or quite often the issue is, as ferrets disperse from their natal colonies, they have to go out and search for, an open territory and a new prairie dog colony. And if your habitat isn't great, which sometimes there are places it's not, that's quite a distance. So they're susceptible to things like coyotes or great horned owls or badgers. So predation can be an issue at smaller sites. At larger sites where there's adequate habitat, it's not as much of an issue.
Okay. What federal land management agencies are hosting reintroductions that you're aware of?
That's a good question. Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has two sites, one in Colorado and one in Montana. The Forest Service has one site in South Dakota, and the National Park Service has, I believe, two sites, both in South Dakota, Badlands National Park and Wind Cave National Park. And the BLM used to have a site in Montana, but that's one of the sites that plague kind of proved to be too challenging, and that site is no longer active.
Okay, here's one. What ways do you see the Farm Bill being tweaked to help tribes undertake imperiled species conservation?
Oh, that's a great question. One of the things that we have done at Lower Brule is, whenever we can, is to provide an incentive to producers. So it's a financial incentive that is provided to them, and that encourages them to work with us to reintroduce ferrets. And so it's a cash payment, and in exchange, or part of the agreement is that they do not control prairie dog colonies and the areas that they ranch. The Farm Bill has been used, Farm Bill programs, and more precisely, I guess, the EQIP program and NRCS. We've used that to provide incentives to some of our producers. It's not a perfect fit, but it has been useful. But as we look forward, we're constantly talking to folks that try to create a better program, something that targets grassland conservation and endangered species conservation, and provides that voluntary, non-regulatory, incentive to producers to participate in black-footed ferret recovery or endangered species conservation anywhere. So we continue to work in that area, and of course we're very optimistic that at some point in time, we'll get there and we'll have something that is best serves our producers and fits our goals of conserving black-footed ferrets.
Cool, thank you for that. Do tribes work with the Smithsonian Research Center in Front Royal, Virginia?
Yes, kind of indirectly. They're one of the captive breeding sites, and so that's part of the black-footed ferret captive breeding program. And so those ferrets that are there eventually do make it out to the field sites, including tribal lands. I think there was an effort a few years ago to link, that site with some of the tribal sites as kind of a network or a partnership where the Smithsonian could do education and outreach. Of course, on their end, they're raising ferrets, but the other side of that story, or the rest of that story, is that those ferrets are taken out to the field, sometimes to tribal lands, where they're reintroduced and trying to restore populations. So there has been that work in the past, and I was just on a call the other day where there's talk of kind of reinitiating some of those partnerships. Too often, once years ago, a partnership would just start to become established, but then the field site would experience a major setback because of plague, and so there really wasn't that great of a story to tell, But as we, implement plague mitigation measures and our ferret populations are increasing at some of these sites, there's that potential to reestablish those connections and partnerships and to continue to share those stories.
Okay. So we've got a comment and a question. I've been privileged to be owned by many ferrets for many years. Are domesticated ferrets related to black-footed ferrets? And do you think domesticated ferrets help to garner interest in the black-footed ferret?
Okay. Well, yeah, they are related. It's quite distant. The domesticated ferret is from Europe. The black-footed ferret, it originated in Eurasia, migrated across the the Beringia or the land bridge. And, historically, we're not, prairie dog specialists, but evolved to become prairie dog specialists, in North America. So sometimes they look quite similar, and so they are related, distantly, but they're of course, separate species. And the follow up to that, do I think that having domesticated ferrets can help garner interest in black-throated ferrets? I think absolutely. I think there's many people out there that have domesticated ferrets, and of course then that tweaks the interest in their distant relative or cousins, and the plight of them out in the wild. So yeah, I think it's a good way to to educate folks and keep that interest going out there.
How many ferrets might live in an average size colony?
Oh, that's a good question, and it's a kind of a tricky question. It depends on a couple things, of course, and like in our field, everything depends. But it depends on how dense the prairie dogs are, and of course, then the size of the colony, other things like that. But typically in my area, we were seeing female black-footed ferrets that have a territory size of about 75 acres or so, sometimes smaller, sometimes a little bit larger. But then males, their territory is about 2 to maybe 3 times that size. So they might need 200 acres, 250 acres. And so sometimes we have colonies that are small that can really only support one female and maybe one male. Colonies that are really large, could support dozens, really. But here, the smallest colony where we've saw ferrets consistently over time was about 30 acres, and that's pretty small. But our prairie dog densities here have been historically quite high.
Well, that's a lot more acreage than I would have imagined for them. How about
the more the merrier.
What is your favorite aspect about working with the black-footed ferret?
That's a really good question. I think there are 2 things about black-footed ferrets that I've really grown to like or appreciate. One is the camaraderie, or the people on the black-footed ferret recovery team. That team is comprised of folks from federal agencies, state agencies, NGOs, tribes. It's a very it's a great group of just hardworking people that all have a common goal and a common vision. It's just really a top-notch group of people to work with, and I've feel very good about being able to be part of that group. The other thing, I guess, for me, and in my part of the world where we don't have a lot of ferrets, when you go out at night and we're doing our spotlight surveys, and you can go hours, sometimes a couple days, without seeing anything, and then when you see that eye shine at night, it makes your heart race. You get excited, you get happy, you get energized, and as you get closer to that ferret, and depending what we're doing, if we're putting down a trap, I mean, there's just a lot of excitement around it. And so every time that happens, it just kind of reinvigorates you and kind of reminds you why we're doing this. And it's just a really exciting feeling that hasn't gone away yet.
Neat. Let's see. Will there be opportunities to add additional sites on on Fish Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, or Forest Service areas?
I hope so. There are some places on federal lands that have suitable habitat for ferrets right now, but there are just a lot of political obstacles in the way. So, the answer is that there are places that are out there, but the politics just have to be, overcame before something like that could happen. I guess I don't know, to be honest, about how many sites, the BLM lands could support, or how much suitable habitat they have out there. I think the Fish and Wildlife Service, with their 2 sites, I believe that's probably the suitable habitat that they have. I think the next places where ferrets could be reintroduced, or on federal lands anyway, are on Forest Service lands.
Okay. So ranchers complain about the black-footed ferret, but do the ferrets provide any ecological benefit to farmers or ranches?
Well, that's a good question. Some of the research that we did here at Lower Brule, and some other research that's been done by Dean Biggins, it's shown or suggested that female black-footed ferrets selectively prey on juvenile prairie dogs. And so what this kind of suggests is that while prairie dogs or ferrets probably won't, control a prairie dog colony, to a point that probably satisfies, a farmer or a rancher. They're not going to eliminate a prairie dog colony, but they can keep enough pressure on those prairie dog colonies, by selectively preying on juvenile prairie dogs, so that it limits or reduces recruitment. And so then it kind of keeps those populations somewhat in check. And that's what we saw at Lower Brule. Our colonies are very small. And some of those small colonies, like I said, are 30 acres in size. We saw over a course of a number of years, fewer prairie dogs on those colonies. That doesn't mean that couldn't have been caused by something else. But it also happened to be where we had females that persisted on those colonies for a number of years. So they may not provide the benefit or an effect to the degree to which maybe a rancher might want, but they certainly are out there eating prairie dogs day after day after day, having some kind of effect.
Does or will climate change affect the populations?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think yes. I think a lot of the work that's been done on plague has suggested that there is, or there are weather or climate variables that can trigger plague epizootics. And so as climates change, droughts occur more frequently, or wet cycles increase more frequently, there are some indications that plague epizootics could occur more frequently. And so on the disease aspect, I definitely think there are implications for climate change and how they affect ferrets. Also, within the range of the black-footed ferret, there is a gradient of precipitation. Lower precipitation in the west, and as you move east, you generally receive higher precipitation. So higher precipitation usually results in more vegetation, in which usually then more prairie dogs or higher densities of prairie dogs, can persist on the landscape. And so with higher densities of prairie dogs, sometimes you can have, and that's kind of what we had going for us at Lower Brule, we had high densities of prairie dogs on small colonies. So we were able to support more ferrets probably on a given footprint as compared to a site farther west that's drier. That was primarily most likely due to our higher prairie dog densities. So as some sites receive more precipitation or some sites receive less precipitation, that then could correlate with higher or lower numbers of ferrets on the ground.
Let's see. You may have mentioned this, but can you say where the hypotic plague originated?
Salvatic plague, Eurasia, from what I can recall. It's an old world disease. Most of wildlife species in that part of the world evolved with it, and so they also evolved resistance to it. But when plague was introduced to North America, our fauna didn't evolve with that disease, and so they didn't have the mechanisms to basically to protect themselves. And so that's why it's so lethal to a lot of our wildlife species. But yeah, Eurasia is where it's thought to originated.
Are you aware of any additional tribes that are considering to participate in the reintroduction process?
Yes. Actually, there are at least 2 right now that are kind of doing the legwork to see what kind of habitat that they have. The service is working with the 3 affiliated tribes in North Dakota, and also the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe in South Dakota and North Dakota. From what I can understand, habitat is fairly limited at the 3 affiliated tribe site, but they have expressed interest in reintroducing ferrets someday. So they've got probably some habitat limitations right now, but they could always work to increase that habitat. Then on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation on the South Dakota side, they've done some mapping with the Fish and Wildlife Service and have identified an area where potentially ferrets could be reintroduced. The habitat is kind of on the lower side, but that's kind of the reality that we're in, is that there aren't really, really great sites out there. Any site that does come online is likely kind of on the lower end of kind of some of the habitat requirements. Yeah, those 2 tribes are would be new sites. And then, as I mentioned, the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, they're doing some community planning and some conservation planning exercises right now, and kind of getting re-involved with black-footed ferret reintroductions is something that they're currently discussing. And so myself and others have offered, to provide any kind of support we can, to any of those sites to kind of help them getting up and running.
Awesome. So I've seen a lot of thank yous. Thank you for your presentation. A lot of excellent presentations. A comment, it says, on the fringe of the black-footed ferret range, thinking of Tohono O'odham Nation, seems food sources are the limiting factor.
Oh, yes, that could be. I'm not familiar with that area, but like I said, most sites that have potential are probably on the lower end, just because most of the big prairie dog complexes have been targeted. I'd be really interested in that site just to see what kind of potential there is. I think that's it's always exciting just to hear of something that might come around, or some of the potential that's out there.
Yeah. Here's another comment. Hey, Shaun, love to chat with you on the work you've been doing along with the other tribes. Great presentation. That's from Melissa Castellano.
Right. Okay, let's talk.
So yeah, it looks like, I think that's our slew of questions for you for today. I just want to really say thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome. Happy to do it.
So again, this was with Shaun Grassel, and he was speaking to us about black-footed ferrets. This will be recorded and available on NCTC's website. And as a reminder, NCTC will continue hosting the Tribal Broadcast Series on the third Thursday of each month. So please join us for our next broadcast, which is entitled The Importance of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Cultural Resources to Native American Heritage, which is on Thursday, April 15th at 3 p.m. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.